This is Professor Wham. I've been working on Apocalypse Redux since October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel. So Apocalypse Redux has two parts. This part, which I'm recording now more recently, April 2nd, almost 6 months after those initial events. And just to give an update, the number of dead in Palestine is approaching 32,000. If you count the injured along with that, you have over 100,000 individuals who have been injured or killed, and that's considered a conservative number. As of yesterday, Israel attacked some very specific aid workers. That's kind of in the news right now. The World Center Kitchen aid workers, and killed all the individuals in that group. I think there were 7. They attacked, IDF forces attacked and destroyed the consulate, the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. And the Knesset is in the process, the Israeli Knesset is in the process of outlawing Al Jazeera from broadcasting within Israeli territories, which would technically include the West Bank and Gaza. Al Jazeera is one of the few news organizations that is still in Gaza. I believe over 30 of their journalists have been killed since the outbreak of this conflict. So there were many things that, and when you listen to part 2, which was recorded 6 months ago almost, you'll have to get through the first, I guess, maybe minute or two, because the attack has just occurred, and I'm voicing some of my initial reactions to the situation. And even though my reactions now are a little more nuanced than they were then, I think the crisis that I was anticipating has been borne out. So I want to start this in a couple of ways. Recently, I participated in an online discussion about the British occultist Dion Fortune, and I'll put the link to that in whatever I post, whatever text I post, and also in the description of this particular tape. In order to prep for that talk about Dion Fortune, I revisited some of Fortune's best-known writings: Mystical Kabbalah, Psychic Self-Defense, Sane Occultism, etc. I also decided to read through the latest edition, edited, and with an introduction by Gareth Knight, one of her letters and articles composed during the so-called Magical Battle of Britain, and that's what the text is actually called, Magical Battle of Britain, since I hadn't really availed myself of that material before. The entries in the Magical Battle of Britain are each labeled with the date for which they were intended, and a note detailing what was going on in the war at the time, along with a commentary about the personal, social context and or disposition of Fortune's occult society at the time. It's really actually a fascinating read, insofar as she is often less formal in these letters and articles than in her normal writing. Further, one can see that she is attempting to construct an applied, practical occultism rather than something more theoretical. Now, as I read through Fortune's letters, I realized that I'd recently read several other first-hand accounts of that conflict, namely the Second World War. The first is the only known record of a concentration camp inmate who kept a diary while in the camp, where both the individual and the diary survived. The second are the prison letters and essays written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer prior to his execution by the SS for his knowledge and support of one of the last attempts to assassinate Hitler toward the end of the war. Then there's Dion Fortune's account. And then I also read a couple of memoirs. They're in one volume by Sebastian Hefner, who these two memoirs were written when he was a young man in the 1930s, detailing his thoughts as Hitler came to power, including what happened to his family, and a description of the process of indoctrination that the Nazis engaged with individuals that were of his social status. And I'll talk more about that later, but he wrote this before his family and his father in particular sent him away to survive the war in Britain. So actually he was in Britain at the same time, Dion Fortune was in Britain doing this magical battle of Britain. So here are these accounts of a world war, the world war that has never really ended, whose long, ghostly, poisonous strands are still finding their way into our lives, our dreams, and our political endeavors. And I guess part of what made me think about all of this is that the specter of the Holocaust and of genocide is invoked at every level in this conflict that is going on in Gaza and in Israel. And we've probably, heard this, the Israelis have the right to defend themselves. The Holocaust, or the Hashoah, as I tend to refer to it, which means, it's Hebrew for the Holocaust, it means the destructive wind. A lot of Hebrew-speaking Jews and Israelis prefer the term Hashoah to Holocaust because the term Holocaust comes from the Greek and it means burnt offerings. So it's kind of gross, in a way. Hashoah means destructive wind, and that's probably more descriptive of what actually happened. But the reason that we use that terminology, and Judith Butler, who has written a number of really interesting reflections on this, she points out that part of the reason why we invoke these terms to talk about what's going on in Gaza, it's not just because Jews talk about it or Israelis talk about it. It's because what happened in the Second World War is what gave us the language to be able to describe the levels of violence and dehumanization and the specter of nationalism becoming a fascism. And obviously, it's not just about Israel, it's about all of us, and certainly about the United States. So here are these very real accounts of this war that has not ended, whose specters, including that of possible nuclear war, we see around us all the time. Now, I thought that perhaps through the writings and experiences of these individuals, I could frame my own thoughts about what is happening, what we are facing as a country, as a world, especially since the commencement of horror on October 7th, 2023. So as I mentioned, part 2 to this vlog was done hastily and reflects the immediate mood and circumstance of my own responses to that catastrophe and the predictable but equally horrific acts of vengeance which have followed. So in some ways you can consider part 2 to be sort of an addendum to this part 1. So this guy that you're seeing here on the screen, this is Sebastian Hefner. He's the guy who wrote the book, Defying Hitler, which are his memoirs of what happened to his life and to his family's life, his family's lives, and that of his neighbors when Hitler took over. And the opening salvo, this was before Germany was quote unquote at war. If you remember, that didn't really start happening until like 1938 or so. It wasn't official until Germany invaded Poland. But before then, there was obviously a lot of ramp up, a lot of things that needed to be done. And at the end of this, I'll read some from his memoir, just to give you a sense of what the indoctrination was like, how subtle it was, because the indoctrination that occurred happened in several stages. And in the case of his family, because he came from a sort of an upper middle class family who was involved in being lawyers. They were part of the legal system. In fact, that's what he was in training to be when Hitler took over. He was just weeks away from taking his exam that would give him a position, kind of an entry-level position in the government as a civil servant. And so his family occupied a particular, his father had retired from something like that. So the people at his level, they weren't indoctrinated in the same way that a lot of other people were. Force wasn't used against them. It was very subtle, and it was something that he talks about, and I'll talk about that at the end. And that's part of why his father sent him away, because his father could not bear for this to happen to him. So the first account I'm going to read about is the account written by Hannah Levy-Haas of her time in the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen from 1944 to 1945, as translated and published by her daughter, the well-known Israeli journalist and essayist Mira Haas. And this woman on the left here, your left, is one of the few pictures of Hannah Levy-Haas. I'm not sure exactly when it was taken, whether it was taken before or after her incarceration. Hannah Levy-Haas was a secular Yugoslavian Jew who was native to Belgrade and who had been raised in an atmosphere sympathetic to Marxism in the Soviet Union. She was also in the resistance and was not captured until quite late in the war. Resistance fighters like Hannah knew about the camps and knew what their fate would be if they ended up in one. To that end, when Hannah was finally captured, she determined that she would try to the best of her ability to keep a record of her experiences. And because she and her diary survived, it is possible to get an insider's glimpse into how Bergen-Belsen was organized and operated. Now, Bergen-Belsen wasn't a death camp as such. It had started out as a training camp for early Nazi recruits and then was transformed into a POW camp. Several other POW facilities were built onto it, is kind of expanded, and eventually it became first a detention center for political prisoners who were then joined by Jews who were permitted to work, and finally into a labor camp. Many concentration camps started out similarly and were built out as the needs of the fascist state expanded. At the time of liberation, Bergen-Belsen was swollen beyond capacity several times over, as inmates from other labor camps, such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, were relocated. There were at least 3 POW camps, or stalags, as they were called, associated with Bergen-Belsen toward the end. And ironically, one of those stalags held my paternal grandfather, who had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge and spent the rest of the year suffering along with concentration camp inmates, albeit behind a different fence. As the Allies pushed into Germany from east and west, the remaining camps, like Bergen-Belsen, were just abandoned by Nazi personnel, with often just a skeleton crew to, quote, mind the shop, so to speak. Water was turned off, food deliveries were ceased. The camp population was literally left to succumb to typhus or starve to death. Since Bergen-Belsen wasn't a death camp, there wasn't a huge crematoria, as in Auschwitz, so the dead were either buried in pits or stacked in piles, or which were manned by the living, or in the end, just left where they died. Now, Hanne Levy-Haas's account details all of this, although she tends to really concentrate on the living, on the daily struggles for food, community, and humanity. She wasn't a religious person, so she makes really no distinction at first between Jews and other inmates, except to notice that the Nazi overlords permitted members of the Polish underground to manage a kind of black market within the camp, which viciously punished anyone who got in their way or tried to do things differently. Hanne herself often was occupied with the camp children, at one point organizing daily lessons for them, with singing, writing, and other activities. Eventually, this became too difficult as starvation and disease set in. When new inmates were brought in from Auschwitz or other camps, it was sometimes possible to get news about how the war was actually going for Germany. And in 1944, when she was brought in, it became clear at a certain point that it wasn't going well. However, that fact didn't really help the situation in the camp. In fact, that made it worse. When she had first come to the camp in 1944, the SS permitted Jews to provisionally sort of rule themselves, or at least organize themselves when it came to food distribution. Once the main part of German leadership departed, they were the ones that permitted or actually introduced the capo system into the camp in order to subordinate Jewish agency entirely, and these were these members of the Polish underground. Bergen-Belsen was liberated on April 15, 1945, by the British. One day in February 1945, toward the end of her diary, Hanne could really only remember the approximate month by this time, no longer the specific day. She writes about how the only way to get any food at all was to capitulate to the capos, this criminal element that, like any syndicate, controlled access to it. Every day was spent trying to determine how much of yourself you would give away for a tiny piece of moldy bread or something worse. Hanne gave away as little as possible, refusing to play the capo's game, and for that she starved, living mostly on the kindness of others who took pity on her circumstances. There were some who still were doing that, even at this late time. At the end of this February 1945 entry, Hanne writes, "Hunger crushes the spirit. I feel my physical and intellectual strength diminishing. Things escape me. I can't think properly, can't grasp events, can't realize the full horror of the situation. Only once in a while, in moments as brief as a flash of lightning, a clear and precise thought crosses my mind, and I wonder, what is this dark, perverse, underhanded force that succeeds in hurling humanity as a whole into such absurd and abominable conditions?" Unquote. It would be another 2 months before liberation came. At a certain point, Hanne quits writing, but she managed to hide and keep the diary. Now, Amira Haas, Hanne's daughter, has placed her mother's diary within several larger contexts in her lengthy introduction and afterword to the book. At the outset, she tells the historical political story of her mother's childhood, such as it was shared with her, her family, most of whom died during the war, her political activities, and her capture by the Nazis. The afterword explores Hanne's relationship with Adam Levy, the Auschwitz survivor to whom she met and married in the post-war rush to exit Europe. The two ended up in Israel, as new citizens of the new state and gave birth to Amira, but neither of them were happy there. Abraham refused the settlement house offered to him by the Israeli government, as it had been taken from a Palestinian family. He would not accept a home stolen from the hands of another. In the late 1980s, at a meeting in Tel Aviv, where a liberal Zionist politician running for the Knesset argued for the necessity to transfer more Palestinians out of occupied territories, Abraham interrupted the gathering of intellectuals and political hopefuls. "I must address the protocol," he said. "Whoever told you it is legitimate to speak about transfer? This is not a legitimate topic. You are discussing a forbidden subject. I have already experienced fascism once. I do not have the strength to go through it again." Now, Abraham loved the land, apparently, the local politics, the language, but never in a Zionist fashion. He referred to himself as a guest, a tourist in Israel, never a citizen. Hannah frequently left Israel to travel abroad, both before and after Abraham's death, as she felt no peace there, even though she understood the emotional reasons why many Jews liked the idea of a Zionist state where Jews could rule themselves and chart their own destinies. Hannah never accepted those emotional reasons. As Amira describes it, neither of her parents were comfortable as Israelis, and neither of them ever really spoke about their experiences in the concentration camps. Their secular Marxist views of the world had failed them, and they didn't want or believe the so-called resurrection that the Zionists offered. Now, Abraham died of a stroke. After his death, Hannah decided to revisit Belgrade, the city of her youth, but it had changed beyond recognition. At other times, she lived in Paris for a while, traveled to the UK and other places, trying to fit in. She would always return to Israel, but that's because her daughter was there and there was no other place to go. Amira remembers two jokes her mother would tell about herself and her inability to stay in one place. So these are the jokes. So here's a quote. Quote, "A Jew, Romanian, say." Abraham was Romanian, her husband, so she was kind of positing him there. "A Jew, Romanian, say, wants to emigrate from Romania, so he goes to a travel agency and says, and the travel agent says, 'To Israel? No, too many wars,' or 'too many Jews,'" she would alternate. "The United States? Too capitalistic. The USSR? Are you out of your mind? South Africa? Racism over there is a bit much." Finally, the Jew asks the travel agent, "Say, haven't you got another globe?" And another joke. "A Jew, another Romanian, immigrates to Israel. After a few months, he misses Romania and goes back. This happens again and again. Somebody asks him, 'Can't you make up your mind? Where do you feel best?' And he answers, 'En route.'" Amira Haas is the only Israeli journalist who has taken up permanent residence with Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, where she bases herself out of Ramallah. Now, I was raised in a very conservative, almost cultish version of Lutheranism. The brand is called the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and though its membership would bridle at me referring to it as cultish at this remove, that's what it now feels like. But more about that in a bit. With that background and my obvious adult response to it, I was surprised to find that I was in recent months drawn to read Letters and Papers from Prison by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was born in 1906, the provocative Lutheran pastor who was imprisoned and later executed by the Nazis for his stance against them and his support for and knowledge of, he didn't help in the planning, one of the last and almost successful attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer, though personally very conservative, was also deeply troubled by German nationalism and was among those who directly opposed the Nazi attempt to forcibly unify all Christian churches in Germany into a single nationalist entity. Individuals of all denominations who opposed this process of unification became loosely bound in a movement that became known as, and is now referred to as, the Confessing Church. The confessing church crossed denominational boundaries, and this compelled church bodies and congregations to work together in a way they had not before, and Lutherans were at the forefront of this process. The challenges and strictures of National Socialism, that's what the Nazis called themselves, by the way, National Socialism, forced some theological rethinking on the part of Lutherans like Bonhoeffer. The Nazi Party demanded total obedience and submission to the state in a manner that Protestant and Lutheran Christianity would say that was only due to God. You couldn't give that kind of homage to a state. You were only supposed to give that kind of loyalty to God. Additionally, Lutherans like Bonhoeffer were repulsed by the blatant anti-Semitism of Nazi propaganda and the general tendency of the Nazis to engage in violent and intolerant behavior. Members of the confessing church saw rightly enough that the Nazi Party wanted to commandeer and use the German churches for political ends in order to have more ammunition to justify their outrages. Now, previous to this, the Lutheran Church in Germany had been largely influenced by its pietistic response to the Enlightenment and to the political intrigues that had roiled German territories since the mid-19th century. Essentially, religion was a private affair that had little to do with what might be going on politically. After Bonhoeffer and the advent of German fascism, that would change. Now, having been raised in an upper-class intellectual, though religious family, his father had actually been a professor of psychiatry, Bonhoeffer had been exposed to the best that academia could offer, a promising young man. After earning his degrees, he traveled to the United States, where he was exposed to several African-American congregations in Harlem, New York, while contemplating attending Union Theological Seminary. He began to realize that theology could not be separated from the living experience of humanity. It had to connect with the actual concerns of everyday life, which meant it had to be willing to confront injustice. Bonhoeffer returned to Germany just as everything there began to change. Now, while a lecturer at Berlin University in 1933, which was the year the Nazis came to power, Bonhoeffer publicly announced over the wireless a strong denunciation of Hitler and the Nazi Party. In the middle of his declaration, the power was cut. No one knows exactly who cut the lines, but we have an idea. This, by the way, if you haven't guessed, is Bonhoeffer on the right, if you're looking at the screen. The lines were drawn. The National Socialists didn't succeed in unifying all the German churches, but only about 20% of them refused to expel ministers of Jewish ancestry, remove the Old Testament from their Bibles, or refused to insert a statement about loyalty to the Führer into the confession of faith. The intact churches, those that refused to submit to the state, became the backbone of the confessing church, resisting Hitler, secreting Jews out of the country, and eventually lending their spiritual and sometimes material support to attempts to overthrow the Nazis, up to and including attempts to assassinate him. Bonhoeffer was not openly persecuted at first. He traveled to England, and while there, the German authorities banned him from teaching in Germany and forbade him from returning to his position in Berlin. At the outbreak of World War II in 1938, Bonhoeffer was offered a position in the U.S. in order to make sure of his safety. He traveled briefly here to begin a speaking tour, but he soon returned to Germany because his whole family, as well as many of his colleagues in Germany, were in danger. It felt to him that he had no business being safe when the whole Christian world in Germany, perhaps in all of Europe, was in terrible danger. In 1937, Himmler declared members of the confessing church to be enemies of the state. So this was immediately before war broke out, and they began to be arrested. Bonhoeffer worked for the Underground, a collection of resistors from aristocratic, military, bureaucratic, and professional backgrounds. Just for reference, Oskar Schindler was one of this company. Okay, he was also in this collection of resistors. They supplied funds, paperwork, transportation, and other necessities to protect pastors, Jews, and others whom the Nazis might disappear. Now, some resistors were actually members of the Abwehr, or of German intelligence, many of whom were personally working to overthrow Hitler from within. It was while working for and with the Abwehr that Bonhoeffer learned the true extent of Nazi atrocity and realized that Germany, indeed Christianity, which had been corrupted in Germany by the Nazi cause, might only be saved by equally heinous acts, up to and assassination of the leadership. And for Germans, this was culturally and politically a difficult mental obstacle to process and pursue. And it was during this time that Bonhoeffer wrote his most famous work, The Cost of Discipleship. It is a modern, in the face of fascism, response to the Sermon on the Mount. In it, he recasts what it might mean to be a martyr, for there is no purity present that can be depended on in a fascism, no innocence in the face of a tyranny that would extinguish all ethics in pursuit of its glory. So basically, in the end, in the name of justice, the evil must be faced, guilt must be accepted, the trigger pulled to end the rule of one who has no remorse or shame one could appeal to, and one can only hope that the grace of God will prevail. One cannot pray for salvation, for such is only up to God. This is his one final conclusion of Luther's credo, sola fide, only by faith. As he put it, this is a quote, "Civil courage can only grow out of the free responsibility of free men. Only now are we Germans beginning to discover the meaning of free responsibility. It depends upon a God who demands bold action as the free response of faith, who promises forgiveness and consolation to the man who becomes a sinner in the process," unquote. And here's another quote. "The ultimate question for a responsible man to ask is not how he is to extricate himself from this whole affair, but how the coming generation shall continue to survive and live for truth. He did not justify his action." That's the end of the quote. And this is talking about Bonhoeffer. "He did not justify his action, but accepted that he was taking guilt upon himself. As he wrote, quote, when a man takes guilt upon himself and responsibility, he imputes his guilt to himself and to no one else. He answers for it. Before other men he is justified by dire necessity. Before himself he is acquitted by his conscience. But before God he hopes only for grace." Earlier in the 1932 sermon, Bonhoeffer had said, "The blood of martyrs might once again be demanded, but this blood, if we really have the courage and loyalty to shed it, will not be innocent. Shining like that of the first witnesses for the faith. On our blood lies heavy with guilt, the guilt of the unprofitable servant who was cast into outer darkness." Unquote. Bonhoeffer tirelessly worked against Hitler behind the scenes at every level of resistance. He was finally arrested and sent to Tegel prison on April 5th, 1943, where he spent most of the rest of the war until the very end. And that was where he writes his letters and papers from prison. There are three main recipients of his letters that have been preserved in this text: his parents, for whom he always maintains a cheerful demeanor, his personal friends, and then a few others, colleagues and officials. The personal letters are the most revealing. He talks philosophy and theology, writes about his younger college days, contemplates what he might do should he be released. Bonhoeffer had just gotten engaged when he was arrested. As his fiancée was the daughter of a rich socialite who was also a resistor, she was permitted to see him in prison. They had actually met because her mother, who was of an aristocratic family, funded a lot of resistance activities. And because they were of an aristocratic family, his fiancée was able to smuggle letters and other materials in and out of the prison. So in those letters, especially to his friends, he talks about his fellow prisoners and his guards, many of whom he befriended, many of whom also smuggled in treats and smuggled out his letters and papers. Apparently, the authorities would dangle hopes of release to him only to snatch it away. In the letters, he thinks of his friends, he thinks of nature, he thinks of changes in the season. Toward the latter half of 1944, word reached the prison that the war was going badly for Germany. The area around Tegel, which is in the state of Berlin, was being strafed daily by Allied bombers, and many nights the prisoners went without power, water, or food. After the last abortive attempt to assassinate Hitler failed, and this was the attempt where a bomb was placed in an attaché case that was put close to him and then at the very last minute was moved, and not because anybody knew that there was a bomb there, but it was just they were like moving it to get things out of the way. It did explode. I think it injured or killed other people, and it just slightly injured Hitler. So after this last abortive attempt, the flailing paranoid Fuhrer ordered a top-down investigation into the background of the perpetrators, most of whom had been high-ranking officials. When it was found that Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, was the main organizer of many of the attempts to kill him, they found his diary, and it was all in his diary. Hitler, in a rage, demanded the deaths of all Abwehr members, and this would include Bonhoeffer. Suddenly, in early April 1945, right after Easter, about this time, Bonhoeffer was loaded into a train along with several other prisoners. After several stops, they ended up in Buchenwald, although they were not processed into the camp with the other inmates, but remained in relatively nice cells. None of them were told what was up. But Bonhoeffer seems to have known, despite his apparent hopes for a different outcome. The last Sunday that he was in the camp, he held services for some of the other prisoners and was then summoned by the prison staff to report. He asked one of the prisoners, an Englishman named Payne Best, to convey greetings to the Bishop of Chichester, who had been a special colleague in England. It's probably actually pronounced Chester. I'm just looking at I'm terrible at those kind of pronunciations. But he'd been a special colleague in England should Payne Best manage to make it out alive. Payne Best did, in fact, make it out alive, and from him we have the last recorded words of Bonhoeffer, quote, "This is the end for me. It is the beginning of life." From Buchenwald, he was remanded to Flossenburg concentration camp, which was used mostly for political prisoners. Bonhoeffer was hanged on the morning of April 9th, 1945. During the post-war period, Bonhoeffer's life and legacy became legendary. The Anglican Church reveres him as a martyr, and his work has influenced, along with that of the liberation theologians, the development of liberal social justice understandings of what it means to be Christian and Lutheran. This brand of Lutheranism didn't touch my family, who came from the older German immigrant-based forms of Lutheranism that still adhered devoutly to the Book of Concord as the only correct way of understanding the Bible. So in reading Bonhoeffer, I remembered that my father's interpretation of things had also come from his readings of Francis Schaeffer, an idiosyncratic Presbyterian who eventually left the United States entirely and created his own neo-Calvinist enclave in Switzerland. Schaeffer maintained a devout hatred of secular society, and as an American, he also dabbled in millenarian thinking. So my upbringing was not really some kind of weird, outdated Lutheranism as much as it was a Lutheranism that was peppered with hefty doses of a cult leader that my father admired. So it was a cult after a fashion, in a way that has actually helped me accept my upbringing. Now, the interview and discussion about Dion Fortune, which I mentioned right at the beginning, and her participation in what has been called the magical Battle of Britain, figures into this here. I'm not because I did this whole interview about it. I'm not. I'll put the link to it in the description. I'm not going to discuss it at length here because I don't really want to go into it. But I will summarize this. Fortune rightly intuited that the Nazis intended to tap into spiritual powers to advance their work. In this sense, what they were doing, their project, their fascist project, was different from the fascist projects of, say, Mussolini and Franco, and certainly from the pervasive authoritarianism in Stalin. While Lenin and Stalin sought to destroy Russian churches, and Mussolini largely ignored the Vatican, Hitler, or rather Himmler and Hitler's service, sought to bring the churches of Germany into the fold of fascism, to remake their spiritual loyalties, to rewrite theology itself. Fortune understood that this was far more dangerous because it was a form of spiritual abuse and therefore spiritual warfare, determined to create a new national soul, or in magical terms, an egregore. This was not simply another political ideology. It was a counterbalance to both socialism and capitalism, authoritarianism and democracy. This is what the Nazis themselves referred to when they called their fascism the Third Way. Still, Fortune insists that whatever power the Nazis are using, it is not more powerful than that of the power her magical network is tapping into. Quote, "It is no use stigmatizing such an operation," she is referring to both Nazi occult practices and British and German propaganda on the radio. "So it is no use stigmatizing such an operation as black magic, for this mental radio, namely the powers of suggestion, invocation, and projection, is as impersonal as Marconi's invention. It is this power that we ourselves make use of in our group meditations, week by week, but we endeavor to use it in humility for the good of all living beings, working for national purposes because we believe in the group soul of British people to be dedicated to the service of God, insofar as the group mind can conceive it. We too can invoke primordial energies from the primitive levels of the national group soul and harness them to archetypal ideas in the group mind of the race," and by this she meant Europeans. Fortune then goes on to explain that the primordial forces the Germans have opened themselves up to are the same as those shared by the English or British. The difference for her is that these primordial forces in her practice have been linked to the powers of light and cosmic law. And for her, of course, that's contained in Christianity, which raises their station and makes them more universal and powerful. The Germans are attempting to yoke the light in Christianity to their understanding of those primordial powers, and in so doing limit and malform both. For her, the solution to this problem, and this is what she suggests, can be found in how the stories of King Arthur, linked as they are to both the pagan past and the history of Christianity, are a better ideal to strive for than that of the German occult attempt to force the submission of Christian morals to a kind of brutal Valhalla. Quote, "Let an ideal clearly held guard the soul of England against insidious propaganda. Let the archetypal image of the age of faith arise to guide us, and the primordial energies of our ancient race be loosed on a quest." Unquote. Now, she was writing this and doing this during the Blitz, all right? So whether one agrees with the particulars, namely the whole race talk and attempts to differentiate between primordial energies in the light of Christianity, it isn't hard to understand what Fortune is getting at. The important thing is not to become the evil you fear when fighting it. Don't allow those who have made you the enemy to get the upper hand of your soul. This, of course, is the challenge of fascism, and the very real challenge of our time. We each will have to face the specific choices that we must make. Now, as I've indicated to some degree in reviewing these accounts, I found it both fascinating and unnerving how various aspects of my life are connected to these individuals and their communities, even at a distance. And the one thing that I did want to talk a little bit about is my connection to the Jewish angle of this. Maybe only some of you know that in the 1990s, I formally converted to Judaism and went through the whole process. The mikveh was an Orthodox, traditional conversion. I wasn't a member of a traditional shul, though, because I'm not a traditional person, but the conversion was traditional enough. During that conversion process in the 1990s, I was taught by the head cantor of a major temple in the Midwestern United States. I will not name that cantor nor the congregation that he served because his political views have had far-reaching effects on his family, especially now, so I will not identify much about him. But one day during our weekly Hebrew sessions, he revealed to me why he had not been accepted into the rabbinic program of one of the most prominent Jewish institutions in the U.S. He was not a Zionist. Members of his large extended family had died in the Holocaust. Some had immigrated to Israel after the war. He wanted Jews to be safe, obviously, and having been brought up like Jews everywhere in diaspora, revered the idea of Israel as a safe haven, a homeland. He liked the idea of a state of Israel. At the same time, he didn't like how that had been interpreted and deployed as a kind of preemptive nationalism, and he was deeply troubled by the manner in which Palestinians as a people had been treated. It was he, over our Hebrew lessons, who told me about the Nakba, the forced expulsion of Palestinians in 1947. And a different history than the one Americans are often told about the 1967 and Yom Kippur Wars. It wasn't that he agreed with terrorism, because I remember once reminding him of the 1972 terrorist Olympic attack in Munich, Germany. But he understood where the anger came from. And this is something that he told me. He said, Jews engaged in terrorism against the Roman occupation. Terrorism is an act of desperation, the sense that you've been pushed into the most egregious things. Remember what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said. He was very uncomfortable with the idea that Jews would put themselves into the position of being the aggressor and then use the horrific example of the Hashoah as a pretext for doing so. So, he told me, is the common Palestinian going to pay the price for every sin done to us? Such a state cannot call itself a democracy. He summarized his views about this in one of the last things he said to me during our final lesson. He said, we Jews, we've spent so much time and energy longing for Jerusalem. We also accomplish so much in diaspora, so much creativity and innovation, even in hardship. At this stage, I'm coming to believe Jerusalem is more an ideal that lies in the heart, and that's where I will carry it. I will never make Aliyah. The physical Jerusalem will ultimately be delivered to those who love her without needing to possess her. Unquote. So as I mentioned, in reviewing these accounts, I found it fascinating and unnerving how various aspects of my life were parallel and connected to these different people. Obviously, in Lutheranism, I was raised as a Lutheran. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words just really struck me, In addition, my paternal grandfather was, as I mentioned, imprisoned in a POW camp connected to Bergen-Belsen at exactly the same time Hannah Levi Haas was an inmate there. They would have been liberated at the same time. And then, of course, my journeys through Judaism taught me that I have not been convinced by the narrative of militant Zionism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, through his example and death, envisioned a different way of understanding the role and purpose of Lutheranism, an ideal I was shielded from by a father who could not embrace the ideal of more grace from a more loving God. And of course, I'm connected in many ways, at least magically, to Dion Fortune, who understood that the true battles of our time are not that of guns and missiles, although there are plenty of those, but a battle for the mind, for our beliefs, our ideals, our souls, in a real psychological way, if you don't believe in eternal souls. What makes people like Hitler and T. Rump powerful is that not even they believe, but rather they harness the beliefs of others. By themselves they are nothing, and they know it. And here's the final story. One more story, and this one is intimately connected to not only much of the above, but to the Sufi lineage of which I am now a part. Alone among these accounts, no diary is connected to this life. However, this individual did write a children's book before taking part of the events that would define her life and death. But her narrative is part of the Inayatiya Tariqa, the lineage, Sufi lineage that I am a part of. It was based in the teachings of the Indian Sufi teacher Hazrat Inayat Khan, who, after being charged by his teacher to bring Sufism to the West, gave up his career as a classical Indian musician tied to the waning Mughal courts and committed himself to this charge. He witnessed the decline of British rule, the beginning of increasing turmoil between Hindu and Muslim in his home state of Gujarat. He witnessed World War I, the Amritsar massacre in 1919. It is known that he personally dealt with the hidden slings and arrows of anti-Muslim prejudice among many Westerners, and when he married into the larger family of Mary Baker Eddy, he and his family had to face the often blatant racism of the times. Still, he persevered. The trials, personal and professional, however, were not without cost, and he died young in 1927 at the age of 44, with his spiritual mission only partially completed. He didn't live to see what would happen in subsequent years, which is perhaps a small blessing. As Nazi Germany expanded its reach into France in the beginning of World War II, Inayat Khan's family, his widow and 4 children, who were living on a small estate just west of Paris in a region called Suresnes, I think that's what it's called, Suresnes, that had been gifted to the family by an early follower, had to flee. His family had to flee. They were offered sanctuary in England among friends. However, the 3 oldest children decided to take matters into their own hands. Hidayat, the youngest son, found a way to sneak back to the estate so that he could collect as many of the manuscripts, notes, and other personal belongings that could be stuffed into a car, and it is due to him that many of his father's writings and teachings were preserved. Some of his students also in other places had preserved certain things. This was a good thing, as the buildings were turned over to SS officers who lived in them for a time. Vilayat, the eldest son, volunteered to serve in the British Navy, working on a mine-sweeping ship, and participated in the Normandy invasion. But it's Noor-Anisa, the young woman on the right. By the way, the woman on the left is Dion Fortune, if you haven't already figured this out, but the woman on the right is Noor-Anisa, Hazrat Inayat Khan's eldest daughter, chose to serve British intelligence in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force as a radio operator who was to work as an agent in occupied France, passing along messages and information. Her code name was Madeline. She returned to France with several other women. Not long after they were dropped into France, because they were kind of dropped, like from a plane flying really low. Not long after they were dropped into France, the Germans discovered the network, and all of the other women returned to England or were captured. Noor-Anisa refused to return and managed to remain on her own, hidden, sending vital information for 3 months before she too was captured by the Gestapo. The average time of survival in the field for such operations was 6 weeks. She tried to escape the Gestapo twice and was eventually classified as a highly dangerous prisoner because of that. She was transferred to Pforzheim prison with 3 other women who had been in similar operators in other locations. She was held for 10 months, after which she was transferred to Dachau on September 11th, 1944. Thereafter, enduring months of brutal interrogation without disclosing anything to her captors, torture, and probable sexual assault, since that was common, Noor-Anisa, along with the 3 women, were executed on September 13th, 1944. Reportedly, her last utterance said to her executioner was the single French word, liberté. Posthumously, Noor-Anisa was awarded the Croix de Guerre, which I cannot pronounce, and the George Cross. Her life and actions have been commemorated numerous times by both the French and British governments, and at least 2 films and a play have been created to tell her story, particularly as she was of Muslim and Indian background. So including her story of resistance to the Nazis is seen as a means by which to ironically redeem the abuses of British colonialism under the Raj. As I am within the lineage of Hazrat Inayat Khan, I am connected to this family through direct initiation. Pirzia, whom I know and have studied under, is the grandson of Inayat Khan through Vilayat, the nephew of Nur Anisa. Hidayat Khan, the young man who snuck back in and grabbed all of the good stuff from the family estate, initiated me as a master teacher and initiator before his death at 99 in 2016. So on all sides, Lutheran, Jewish, Muslim, magician, resistors, mystics, occultists, I am surrounded by the light of those who saw clearly that the forces of darkness are principally human in origin and expression. 3 of these people saw the internal walls of a concentration camp. 2 of them died in one. One was displaced forever, and the last died a year after the war ended, her energy no doubt depleted by the trauma, and that's Dion Fortune, who died a year later. Events like World War II, Shoah, seem far removed for many people. Indeed, in a very short time, less than a decade, it will be a century since the first concentration camp was built, which was Dachau, which was built in 1933. Very publicly, it was announced in the papers it was for political prisoners. Yet the shadow of that war, those horrendous events, looms ever longer and larger, and not simply because of how terrible those shadows were. It's more that human beings have not learned sufficiently, and that there are others who have kept the hatreds and fears alive, and still more, who actually believe somehow that the Nazis were up to a good thing. There are even those who believe that. In fact, one fairly well-known metaphysical author who is credited with inspiring many in the current New Age movement wrote a dissertation in which he analyzed what the Nazis should have done to succeed in their final project. Essentially, he says they failed due to poor management skills. Thank the gods they didn't have a Jeff Bezos on their side, right? And if you message me privately, I'll tell you who this person is because I've read the dissertation. So let's get back to Sebastian. Sebastian Hefner spent his entire life, again, he's the author of Defying Hitler, he spent his entire life trying to understand the Nazis and Hitler and how they had come to power and why they had come to power and what is this poison of nationalism and how does trauma play into it? I mean, he's written several other books. And in all these, he tries to analyze his own nation, his own history, his own family. But to me, some of the most powerful stuff he writes is in this book, Defying Hitler, where he talks about the process of gradual indoctrination, basically kind of an eclipsing, if you will, of one's personal sense of responsibility and identity before the power of a state. And they did this in little ways and in big ways. At the beginning, against open resistors in neighborhoods, they would just send militias out. And if there was a member in your neighborhood that had spoken out against the Nazis, this was in the beginning, spoken out against the Nazis, they would break into your neighbor's home, they would murder that neighbor, murder his family, and string them up on a gallows at the yard for the entire neighborhood to see. So that was kind of like one of the first things they started to do. And they would do that selectively, very selectively. And then later on, in the case of his father, who was retired, his father had neglected to join the Nazi Party. And you didn't have to join the Nazi Party officially, but if you were somebody like his father, who was a pensioner, what they would do is they wouldn't say you had to join the Nazi Party. His father was retired and depended on that retirement. What they would do is they would send you a letter, and the letter was like a questionnaire. And you needed to answer that questionnaire in a certain way, and it would say at the bottom that if you don't fill out these questions and you don't return this by a certain date, your pension will simply be cut off. And of course, all of the questions had to do with loyalty to the state, how you felt about your German heritage, how you felt about what the Nazis were doing economically. I mean, it was all done very skillfully and psychologically. And the story that he tells is that his father finally got that letter and sat with it for a long time. And then before the deadline, went in his room and filled it out and mailed it himself, and came home and began to vomit profusely for several days. And thereafter had great difficulty keeping any food down, and eventually died of a stomach ailment. He said his father basically starved himself to death. That was his only resistance that he could utter, because his pension not only took care of him, but it took care of his wife, it took care of his household. So if he had resisted, he, as an old man, would have not only deprived himself but his family of their means of sustenance. And so he went ahead, Sebastian Hefner went ahead and, or Hoffner, I guess how you pronounce it, he went ahead and took his exams. And he told his father originally he was going to stay. But eventually, the indoctrinators caught up with him. And this is how they did it. If you were a young professional man, they would tell you that you needed to report to a particular training center, and that this training would be done. This training was to outfit you for your new role as a new judicial adjudicator. By this time, all the judges and the adjudicators, for the most part, had been replaced with pro-Nazi judges and adjudicators. And so everything was done very much on the up and up, very, very legal, everything. So it was like a boot camp, really. But they weren't taught anything about how terrible the Jews were. It wasn't like heavy-handed. What it was a gradual series of privations over time that were done in increments. Like you would have to sit up and do exercises all night, but then you'd get to sleep, and then there'd be food shortages, but then you'd get some food. It was like that, and then occasionally you would be introduced to someone who was really anti-Semitic and kind of crazy, and it was perfectly fine if you thought he was nuts, and you were encouraged to talk about it. But what it really was creating a sense of comradeship with the other people that you shared this with. And as that comradeship was developed, and it took several weeks for this to do so, as it was developed, he said he found himself relaxing his defenses. And as the defenses would be relaxed, different ideas would be introduced to them. And they would also be able to tell, the commanders, the trainers would be able to tell who was more suited for. Eventually, maybe they could do psychology tests. They were basically doing psychology tests to be able to see, who could be recruited to be a Nazi, like an SA agent or an SS agent or a soldier maybe, and who maybe wouldn't be associated with that, but who could be convinced not to resist. You see, it was all done very skillfully. He says, comradeship is a part of war. Like alcohol, it is one of the great comforters and helpers for people who have to live under unbearable and human conditions. It makes the intolerable tolerable. It helps us cope with filth, calamity, and death. It anesthetizes us. It comforts us for the loss of all the amenities of civilization. Indeed, that loss is one of its preconditions. It receives its justification from bitter necessities and terrible sacrifices. If it is separated from these, if it is exercised only for pleasure and intoxication, for its own sake, it becomes a vice. It makes no difference that it brings a certain happiness. It corrupts and depraves men like no alcohol or opium. It makes them unfit for normal, responsible civilian life. Indeed, it is, at bottom, an instrument of decivilization. The general promiscuous comradeship to which the Nazis have seduced the Germans has debased this nation as nothing else could. And keep in mind that the Nazis, and this is before the internet, this is before the social networks, social media, the Nazis, with their extremely efficient bureaucratic thoroughness, could basically find almost any individual in their society and be able to name all the members of that family. They would enter into your home in the most intimate of ways. So if you can just imagine how easy it would be to do that now. Okay. And of course, one of his criticisms about German society at the time, prior to the Nazis emerging, was that there was this, it was sort of a reaction to World War I. There was this very commercial, materialistic society. There had been a lot of financial difficulties because, of course, the economy of Germany had crashed. And so people were interested mostly in acquiring things. There was their version of mass media and kind of an obsession with technology. And a curious sort of, especially in the young, a curious sort of disinterest in an internal life. It was like people didn't have their own identities. People were searching for an identity. And of course, it was into that vacuum that the Nazis stepped. So anyway, I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like myself that I'm sleepwalking through the final days of civilization. I feel like I'm in a deja vu. Many levels, many layers. So I'm going to end this Apocalypse Redux Part 1. And you can listen to Apocalypse Redux Part 2. It's quite different from what I've discussed here. And it's about different interpretations of apocalypse in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thinking. So I hope I've given at least some of you something to think about in all of this.